Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Aseem Desai. He's a cardiac electrophysiologist. He's the author of the book, Restart Your Heart, the playbook for thriving with AFib. And he wrote the Kevin MD article, During this terrible pandemic, let's make compassion go viral. Aseem, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
So we'll get into your article and book in a little bit, but first off, can you just share your story and your journey to where you are today?
Absolutely. I'm a cardiac electrophysiologist. I practice in Southern California. My main focus is on AFib, but also a variety of other arrhythmias, and do the whole gamut from clinical care as well as to robotic heart ablation and a variety of other technology uses. In terms of my upbringing, I grew up in Chicago, and then I went to college and med school at Northwestern University as part of the 7-year med program, and then did all my post-grad training at Stanford. Did my first job was actually faculty at University of Chicago as an electrophysiologist. And then I landed in Southern California, back in 2005 now. It's been that long. And I've been a practicing electrophysiologist here.
And as an electrophysiologist, how has the pandemic affected not only your practice, but the patients you've been seeing as well?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, Kevin. It's almost like EP suits itself for telemedicine, because so many of our patients have implantable devices. So whether it's a pacemaker, whether it's a defibrillator, or whether it's an implantable loop monitor, we're able to assess our patient's rhythm from a sort of telemedicine standpoint. We can pull up most of the data online at the various vendor websites, and we can look at their real-time rhythm. We can look at the arrhythmia history. So that has really, I think, been helpful in terms of the remote monitoring and how we can use that to take care of arrhythmia patients. What's interesting is a lot of our patients, and in particular AFib patients, are really struggling right now. You know, you have the emotional stress component, and we know about the brain-heart connection and how the autonomic nervous system certainly plays a role in triggering arrhythmias. And then you also have the increased rate of alcohol use, and alcohol is the enormous trigger for atrial fibrillation and other arrhythmias. And then the last piece is people are just less active, and we know that obesity and weight gain are also large triggers for atrial fibrillation. So I think the pandemic has opened up a lot of doors in terms of how we can help people and really focus on lifestyle rather than just doing procedures. It really kind of helps us bring back to focusing on lifestyle for people and how that can actually make a big impact for their arrhythmias.
All right, let's talk about your Kevin MD article. During this terrible pandemic, let's make compassion go viral. Now, for those who haven't read that article, can you walk my audience through it and maybe share the story of why you decided to write it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll start with some of my personal stories. So I went through physician burnout myself a few years ago. I had all the signs and symptoms. And during that time, I think, I don't know about you, Kevin, but whenever you're faced with these different challenges in life, sometimes you have to fall really hard to have your eyes opened. And I think that's happened to a lot of healthcare providers who have gone through burnout. And during that time, I came up with the idea of a resilience toolbox. And so I started accumulating these different self-care tools, whether it was mindfulness, whether it was exercise. And the thing that I came across, there was a conference a few years ago in San Francisco, the American Conference on Physician Health, and the prior Surgeon General, the 19th Surgeon General, Murthy, he actually talked quite a bit about the epidemic of isolation and how we need to use compassion more in our own lives and for our fellow citizens. And as I started going through the self-care and learning about techniques for self-compassion, it then resonated with me as things were happening in the pandemic, and how you sort of had this polarization, people who were actually lifting up and trying to help their fellow citizen, and then you had people that were obviously struggling and kind of putting out a lot of negative energy, so to speak. So that really got me interested in the idea of not just self-compassion and how it's really a skill, and it's almost like a subset of mindfulness, but then also how you can develop skills for compassion with others. People often think that we're all sort of born with these inherited traits, whether you're a compassionate individual or not. And that's simply not true. A lot of science has now shown us that you can actually develop this sort of skill, almost like, a mind muscle memory kind of thing. And so the article, the real focus is how you can have a win-win-win during the pandemic. So the first win by helping another person is you help another person. And it's important to distinguish empathy versus compassion. So empathy is stepping into someone's shoes and sharing that experience. compassion is doing that, but also doing something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the action. And I think that's the key part of compassion. And so with the first win, it's really about, say you go shopping for someone and help them get groceries. That's their win. And then the win for you is the automatic mental boost and emotional boost, that dopamine boost of helping people. And there's a lot of studies that show that helping others really can affect one's quality of life in a good way. And then the third win is this upward spiral you can see in a community. And I talk about a couple of examples of natural disasters and how certain communities that had this sort of looking out for each other mindset actually recovered much faster from a physical infrastructure standpoint than communities that didn't. So this obviously has a lot of relevance now, not just in the pandemic, but what's going on in politics in our country and everything else, is the idea of really being thoughtful of whoever you're interacting with and trying to develop that skill for doing so.
So a lot of my audience are primary care clinicians. I'm a primary care internal medicine physician myself. So can you walk us through some scenarios where physicians can practice that compassion and put themselves in that position for that win-win-win that you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think let's talk about, the individual physician. I mean, a lot of physicians are really struggling right now, healthcare providers, either if they're on the front lines, they're getting burnt out, and there's a lot of pressures from a variety of standpoints, intensivists that are having to take people off ventilators and no one else is in the room, and this sort of feeling of isolation. So I think that, doing that compassion practice, and it's an example of that would be like a loving kindness meditation. And so a loving kindness meditation, it's pretty well studied. You can even Google it. I talk about one in the article, but you really start focusing on yourself and you say, may I be happy? May I be safe? May I live in equanimity? And you can pick a variety of different phrases. And then you start imagining other people. And so for a physician, for example, you may imagine a patient and say, may you be safe, may you be healthy. And then you can start to connect it to family members. And I think what's key about the compassion part is, so you start there, and then you start going into people you feel neutral about. And then you start going into people you may have challenging relationships with, or people you don't know that you're really struggling with when you're watching them on TV or what have you. And I think it really kind of gives you it takes you out of that fight or flight response and really gives you more of a bird's eye view and a better perspective on how everyone is fighting a battle in some way, whether it's internally or externally. So I think for the practicing physicians, if you're going to take care of yourself and you put your own oxygen mask on first, you're going to be a better clinician. And it's also something, there's a lot of physicians that are into mindfulness that are teaching these things in their practices, and that you can use a variety of different tools that are out there. The Institute of Functional Medicine, for example, has a lot of tools to teach patients how to meditate or do these compassion practices.
What are some of the resources that physicians can look to if they want to practice more compassion? What kind of suggestions online can they read?
So my favorite app is Calm. I think that it's widely available. Most people know about it. LeBron James actually just got on the app. So he's talking about sort of being in that flow state from an athlete standpoint. But Calm, that app, for example, has so many different options in there. And there are several meditations on compassion and self-compassion. And that's partly how I learned about the loving kindness meditation practice, was actually through the Calm app. But there's Headspace and there's a variety of other online resources as well. But I personally find the Calm app very helpful, and you can only take a few minutes a day, and it can really make a big difference for you in the rest of the day and how you interact with other people, for example. And so I think a big teaching point that I learned myself that can really make a difference is how you spend those first few minutes of the day can just make a total difference in the rest of your day, personally, as well as how you can help other people. So for me, for example, I get up in the morning, I do a little spiritual reading, I do a meditation, I go for a run and do some kind of social interaction, whether it's with my family or colleagues or what have you. And it's only a few minutes, but it really makes a big difference. And that's something that your audience, for example, could, maybe they're already doing, and if they haven't done it, taking that micro step of trying something out. Whether it's just getting the free Calm app and trying a few meditations out, but just taking that micro step for behavior change.
When it comes to physician burnout, a lot of it is because of the external factors that are out of the physician's control. It could be the electronic medical record, it could be pressure from administration to see more patients. So, without changing the systemic factors, I guess my question is how effective can resilience training and mindfulness and meditation, how effective can they really be if we don't fix the systemic factors that contribute to burnout?
And that's the key question, Kevin. It's a great one, and that's something that they discussed at the conference on physician health that I went to several years ago, and you hear ongoing discussions now in our health system, for example, in Providence, we're talking about it as well. And there's that dichotomy or that disconnect between the values that an institution or a health system states they have
Mhm.
versus what they're actually doing. And electronic health record is a great example of that. So it really it's a responsibility of the health system as well as the individual. But as you said, you basically you make a list, like what are the things that you can do personally to take responsibility for helping to either reduce your burnout, prevent burnout. And I think a lot of it really comes down to that daily skill set. Yeah, I mean, mindfulness is not going to be enough to necessarily completely protect you from burnout, but certainly it'll reduce the degree of burnout.
Mhm.
I think that, it's about developing that personal resilience. And then you have this infectious effect. And it's kind of the idea of the article too, this viral effect that when, for example, people saw the shift in me, even when I would go in and scrub in on an ablation in EP lab to do an AFib ablation. In the past, I used to get stressed out. I hear the cath lab staff talking about their weekend plans as I'm doing like an 8-hour flutter ablation, and it was really, really frustrating.
Mhm.
And as I started doing this mindfulness practice, it's just put me into this zone, this flow state, and people notice it. Your colleagues notice it, and they say, "Oh, what are you doing differently?" So I think that kind of thing also can have an exponential effect. It doesn't fix the whole problem of healthcare provider burnout, but I do think it has to start in many ways with the individual. And then I think more of us who practice this really need to get involved in teaching others. And so I have some colleagues I've connected through social media. For example, Jonathan Fisher is pretty well known in the social media circle for being a teacher of compassion and mindfulness for healthcare providers. And he's done a lot of great work in that area. And so he's taught me a lot. And so I think
Mhm.
we can learn, I think social media in particular, I mean, that's how I connected with you. But social media in particular, I think is an opportunity for physicians, to not feel alone. And
Mhm.
I've bonded with people across the Atlantic that I find we connect on certain things. And oftentimes I feel like the things I'm interested in, it's hard for me to find colleagues in the local area that may have those same interests, whether it's mindfulness or what have you. But then I'm able to do it through Instagram, or I'm able to do it through Twitter. And I think that's how we can, use social media in a positive way.
We're talking to Aseem Desai. He's a cardiac electrophysiologist. He wrote the Kevin MD article during this terrible pandemic. Let's make compassion go viral. Aseem, you're also the author of the book Restart Your Heart, the playbook for thriving with AFib. Can you share with my audience a little bit about that book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've had my own medical issues over the years. And when I was first diagnosed, I really could have used just sort of a credible playbook, something that's easy to read, that walks me through what, the disease is all about, and then the next steps to take in terms of managing it. And that's the idea I came with the playbook. One day I was walking a gentleman out who was in persistent AFib for 5, 6 years, and he was told nothing could be done about it. He was told that by other cardiologists, by other physicians, and as electrophysiologists, we live and breathe AFib. And I was able to offer him some of the newer techniques and technologies, and he walked out in sinus rhythm. And he turned to me and he teared up and he said, "I wish I had known about this, years ago. I wish I had some guide that took me through the process." And then a light went off in my head and I said, "I got to create
Mhm.
this playbook." So the playbook it's not just for patients with AFib, it's actually for families, and it's actually for your audience. So it's really hard to have a conversation with patients in a 15, 20-minute office visit
Mhm.
about AFib or other issues. And here you can provide a resource and say, "Hey, this is more information that you can learn." And it's an integrative approach. So it does incorporate things about diet and lifestyle and the brain heart connection, but then also the technology part and the whole gamut really of how to prevent AFib, identifying risk factors. It's also it's a book for people who are obese, people who have diabetes, people who have sleep apnea. So I see it obviously as a initial audience is AFib, but really it's kind of got that broader effect. And honestly, the reason why I wrote it, Kevin, in the beginning was grieving process. So I didn't
Mm-hmm.
even know I was going to write about AFib. I had never written a book. I've written a lot of articles, and my mom suddenly passed away from a cardiac arrest, and I was just overwhelmed with everything that happened. Getting a call in the middle of the night that they were coding her, and I had no idea she was even sick, and so it was hard to process that. For me, writing has always been a therapeutic thing. So I started. If you look at the introduction of the book, it's actually the story of when I was a kid and my dad had a heart attack, and kind of talking about these different things. And then it connects over into these experiences have helped me be a better doctor and have allowed me to be more empathetic and compassionate for my patients. And that's what led me to then think, what would I want if I had AFib? What kind of credible source? And there's a lot of misinformation out there
Mm-hmm.
on AFib. It's a very individual disease. People talk about so-and-so had 5 ablations, it didn't work, or so-and-so had a pacemaker, or so-and-so's doctor said, don't do ablation, it doesn't work. And it's not that it's all about ablation, but the point being that we really need to deliver more credible information out there on AFib and other aspects of health.
One of the other Kevin MD articles that you wrote was a connection between atrial fibrillation and burnout. Can you just briefly share with the audience what that connection is?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a study that I referenced, and it actually was almost 12,000 people. They followed over many, many years, almost 20 years, and they looked at different risk factors for burnout, and they ended up discovering that the development of atrial fibrillation actually was strongly connected to burnout. And, there's obviously other variety of variables that go on in there, but AFib, like many other conditions, it's this sort of systemic disease. It's this inflammatory disease. And then you have the brain-heart connection that I mentioned. And so it naturally makes sense that if you're living in a chronic fight or flight response, which is really what, burnout is, that your autonomic nervous system is activated. So it's going to increase your risk for cancer. It's going to increase your risk for stroke and a variety of other things. No surprise that AFib is now part of that. So I think it really highlights the relevance of AFib. And it's arthritis of the electrical system. 1 in 4 people over age 40 at some point in life is going to get AFib. 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 of your audience members, and that's controlling for all the other risk factors. It's aging related arrhythmia, amongst other things. And then I think the last piece, just to mention about AFib and the concept of burnout, we have a lot of young people now that are showing up with AFib, a lot of athletes, and there's reasons for that related to the autonomic nervous system and the vagus nerve. But the point being is that you get this perfect storm of someone, for example, who has a lot of workplace stress, and then they're drinking a lot of alcohol, and then all these other components, and then they get AFib. So it's kind of an interesting twist on things. And just yet another reason to try to work on ways to prevent burnout.
Sure. And my final question, Aseem, what's your take-home message you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
My take-home message is for those who don't meditate to learn how to try, because it really makes a big difference. And especially during these times right now, we're under so much stress that any kind of resilience toolbox, self-care can make a huge difference. And even small little steps every day can really make a big difference. So my advice is really to meditate, to be compassionate to yourself, and to be compassionate for others.
Aseem, thank you so much for sharing your insight and stories, and thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.